An article came out recently titled "The Emerging Crisis in Critical Thinking." Crisis, it was titled, in critical thinking. Now, we saw this morning, what was the percentage? About 5% were critical thinkers at an all-time low. In fact, the study said that, but what I found interesting, and this is going to tie into what we'll talk about in this talk, this was focused on the attempts in early childhood with different types of learning that we're seeing now, and it's tying it into the crisis in critical thinking. The mid to late 1990s witnessed the rise of misguided attempts to artificially accelerate brain development in children. Have we seen that? Parents began force-feeding infants and toddlers special educational DVDs and flashcards in the hopes of taking advantage of unique features of the developing brain to hardwire genius by the age of 3 or even younger. This is a common trend in society today. What has been the result? Well, according to this article, according to Dr. Stephen Camarada, unfortunately, rather than creating a generation of super geniuses, as we've tried to do, there are emerging reports that although modern students are quite adept at memorizing and regurgitating facts presented in class or in reading materials, the ability to reason, to think critically, and problem solve, 3 very important things, has been dramatically reduced in recent years. Fascinating. Now, I find it interesting that in the book Christian Education, it tells us that parents should be the only teachers of their children until they have reached 8 or 10 years of age. As fast as their minds can comprehend it, the parents should open before them God's great book of nature. And the only schoolroom for children until 8 or 10 years of age should be in the open air, amid the opening flowers and nature's beautiful scenery. So we have modern educational pressures earlier and earlier. Let's create some super geniuses, it says. Let's give them flashcards. Let's read to them while they're still in the womb. That's a common thing now. Push it earlier and earlier, and hopefully we'll create a generation of super geniuses. And yet we also have this counsel, written over 100 years ago, that the only schoolroom until 8 or 10 years of age should be in the open air. What's correct? Is this sort of old-fashioned? It doesn't apply anymore in today's modern age? Well, that's a good question, and let's look at some of the research on that. And in fact, that is our tactic number 10, as we looked at 9 tactics this morning, and I sort of held you in suspense for our 10th one. Our 10th tactic is what I've titled early formal academics. And this could be named various things. This is just what I've called to title it early formal academics. They did a study a few years back, and they compared kindergarten classrooms from 1998 and 99 with kindergarten classrooms in 2010 and 11. So a 12-year difference. And what the purpose of this study is to see if anything has changed in kindergarten over a 12-year span. Has anything changed? Is it different? The kindergarten that we used to know is not the kindergarten of today. So they looked first of all at teachers' opinions. Teachers' opinions in 1998. Well, 48% of them considered reading fluently was too much to expect of kindergartners. I would have to agree, that's a bit much to expect of a kindergartner, isn't it? Well, they asked them 12 years later in 2010, and they found that, well, only 10% felt that way now. They asked, well, should children learn to read in kindergarten? Well, 29% of them said that, yeah, children should learn to read in kindergarten in 98. Now, in 2010, 78%. Opinions have changed. In 98, 53% of kindergartners were in full-day kindergarten programs, while in 2010, 12 years later, things had changed. 81% now in full-day kindergarten programs. Time for art and music has dwindled. The playtime that children used to have in kindergarten is being eliminated many times as we're pushing for greater academic success. In 2010, 90% of kindergartners were being taught to read. 97% were in classes in which composing and writing complete sentences was a needed skill. And 99% learning capitalization and punctuation. kindergarten is not what it used to be. Hence, the title of this research project, the title of the article was called, "Is Kindergarten the New First Grade?" In other words, they're expecting so much out of kindergartners now that it might as well be first grade, or even second grade maybe. And because of that, now 84% of 2010 and 11 kindergarten teachers feel that attending preschool is very important for success in kindergarten. And in fact, if you want to know the pre-entry requirements for kindergarten, well, you better already know how to use pencils and paintbrushes, know most of the letters of the alphabet, and be able to count to 20 before you even get there. Well, things have changed, haven't they? Is this different from what you did in kindergarten, if you went to kindergarten? Define the age. Yes, this was done in the U.S., where the standard age for kindergarten is either 4 or 5. So is that the same here in New Zealand? I appreciate you bringing that up. Okay. Grade 1. Okay, right. So your grade 1 is the same as ours, starting at about age 5 or 6. It depends on the state often. But okay, so your kindergarten starts at 3, so about a year earlier than ours does. And so, yeah, there would be some differences in age, but either way, they're asking a lot more out of them than they used to. So the question would be, is this okay? I remember we talked about age segregation this morning, and we said, well, hey, it's a new thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. We did see that it was a negative. But same here. Is this a negative thing that we're asking so much out of the little kids now in the form of academics? I believe we can ask a lot out of them, and they should be learning a lot. There's much that young children should be learning. But is it right to be asking so much academic pressure out of them? And a lot of administrators and parents and teachers, they're very thrilled with these new developments, and they say, well, hey, the kids are learning. Isn't that the point? Well, yeah, they should be learning. Nobody's arguing that. But what should they be learning is the question. And a significant body of major scientific research with some input from some of the top scientists, developmental psychologists, neurophysiologists around the world are telling us that there may be some unintended consequences to this push, that maybe we aren't creating super geniuses after all. And they're also telling us that while kids may be learning, they may also be missing out on key areas of development, and that there's a side effect to this process. The price to pay isn't worth it, they tell us. The early academics may be doing more harm than good. And the weight of evidence is telling us that an academic setting before the age of 8 or 10 is actually damaging to the mind and one of the devil's tactics for destroying good thinking abilities. How and why? Well, let's find out. Let's hear a bit of science here. Anyone know what this is? A neuron. It's a brain cell. Yeah, it's what your brain is made out of. It's what your brain uses for all of its functions, including listening to me right now, if you are. You were born with about 100 billion neurons, but you don't have that many now. And that's a compliment, because the whole process of brain development involves three main areas. We have specialization of neurons, where the brain actually takes its mass of neurons that you were born with and begins, depending on the environment and the experiences that a child goes through, it will identify which neurons are needed and begins tossing out the other ones that are unneeded. So for example, they say that at birth, you are born with about all the neurons you need to learn any language in the world. But then as you learn your native tongue, or even a second one, which can be a good thing, your brain says, hey, I don't need those neurons for those other languages anymore. Let me specialize and make this whole language thing more efficient. It's good that it's weeding those other ones out. And so it tosses the other languages aside, the other language neurons aside. That's why come age 13 or so, it becomes a little more difficult for a young person to learn a second language. And that's just an example of brain specialization. Another factor we see is synaptic growth, where the synapses between the neurons are growing. But what's more important to our discussion this evening is myelination. Myelin is an electrically insulating compound that coats the axon of the neuron, as we see here, and it speeds the information transfer. So previous to myelination, a neuron is virtually unusable. When it myelinates, it speeds the information transfer by about 100 times, and all of a sudden we have a usable neuron. Trying to force information transfer over an unmyelinated neuron is a futile process, and furthermore, asking an undeveloped brain section to perform a task for which it is not ready can actually lead to problems, as I'll get to in a moment. But let's understand the myelination process a bit. It occurs in stages and on a fairly set schedule. If we begin at birth, we have all but the most essential bodily functions unmyelinated. We're just born without a whole lot of myelination already happened. We have what we need to survive. But what this also tells us is that a lot of development occurs after birth. Now, that maybe you're saying, well, of course, I knew that. And yeah, we can see that very clearly as we watch a child grow and develop. But if we just look in at the brain, most myelination occurs after birth. And in fact, let's look at a brief schedule. I won't look at all of this, but if we begin at conception to about 15 months, we see very basic brain development. Moving on to about 15 months in through 4.5 years of age, we see limbic system and relationship development. And if I could just mention a side note, this is why it's very important that the little ones are with their mothers, and especially a caring parent. As much as possible, this is the time where they develop their understanding of secure relationships. It is also the time for the limbic system, which is the emotional area of the brain. Very important for a child to have emotional security at a young age, and that's why mom is best. But then, at about 4.5 in through around 7 years in girls, about 9 years in boys, we see right hemisphere elaboration. Elaboration, myelination, development, those are kind of synonymous terms that we use. So when we're talking about myelination, and this slide says elaboration, same thing. So 4.5 to 7 years for the right hemisphere. But let me just clarify that boys have a slower growth period during these stages than girls. I didn't say boys were slow. But they do develop differently when it comes to right hemisphere development. And there are many reasons for this. One of them is that the right hemisphere is very important for spiritual strength. And what was God's purpose for the men? To be spiritual leaders in their families, right? And so some extra time with an area of the brain needed for spiritual strength. I don't think that was an accident on God's part. And then at about 7 years in girls and about 9 years in boys, we begin to see the left hemisphere develop. Begin development. Now, if you notice the right hemisphere, this is a stage of development. It's a period of time where it's developing. If we look here, though, the 7 to 9, that's just pretty much a starting point, and it continues through even into the teen years. And then at 8 years, we see frontal lobe development. And so I just want to focus on these three areas: the frontal lobe, the left hemisphere, and the right hemisphere. And if we look here at some functions of these hemispheres, we have the left hemisphere that is a primary processing center for detail, parts and processes of language, linear patterns, logic, critical thinking, numbers, and reasoning skills. The right hemisphere, on the other hand, deals often with images, with rhythm, and let me just interrupt myself here. It is sort of a myth that it is a myth, not sort of, it is a myth that you're either right-brained or left-brained. We do use our whole brains, thankful for that. And so as I mentioned, these areas of the brain that are responsible for certain functions, it's not that we only find these functions only in the left hemisphere. You will find them interplaying with other areas of the brain. Other areas of the brain help with these functions, but the left hemisphere is still a primary processing center for these functions, just as is the right hemisphere a primary processing center for things such as images, rhythm, emotion, intuition, imagination, creativity, feeling, faith, belief, and large motor control. Now, looking at this chart and the different functions of both hemispheres, which hemisphere do you think would be critical and important for sit-down academic learning as we know it? The left, absolutely. You got to have the detail, the language, the linear patterns, the numbers, the critical thinking, reasoning skills. Those are very important for school as we know it. And so I'll get to more of that in just a moment. But then the primary motor cortex, that's located within the frontal lobe, and we see fine motor development, inner speech, fine motor eye teaming, that's using both eyes to focus on a subject, foveal focus, which is two-dimensional focus. I'll define these more in a moment here, but the primary motor cortex, very important for these functions, which are very important for academic learning. So if we go back to this schedule of development, and we have the right hemisphere moving in through 4.5 to 7 years, or even 9 years in boys, 9 or 10, even 12 sometimes, with the left hemisphere beginning development around 7 to 9 years, that's sort of a problem, is it not? Do you see a problem? I mean, what's a standard school starting age? 5, yeah? Okay, yeah, in the U.S. we have some preschools starting at 18 months. They're pushing it earlier, though. But even, I mean, suppose it's 6. Suppose we were really generous and called it 6. That's before the left hemisphere, an important area of the brain for academic functioning, is beginning development. How are we going to solve this? And then the primary motor cortex, as we saw, was important and developing at around 8 years of age. So what happens if we give kids the academic study before the brain regions are fully developed? Can we accelerate learning somehow? Can we speed it up? Well, we've tried pretty hard. But as it turns out, a lot of damage is done, and asking an undeveloped brain section to perform a task for which it is not ready can lead to problems. Let's assess some of that damage. Are you following so far? Okay, good. Let's move to something known as neuroplasticity. Young minds are incredibly plastic. Even they're finding adult minds very, very plastic. It's amazing. We have just scratched the surface of neuroscience. It is amazing what we're continuing to learn. But neuroplasticity is an incredible ability that the Lord has designed in us to be able to adapt. First of all, if we take childhood, it allows us to adapt to our environment. That's a huge responsibility, by the way, for parents. They really are shaping the mind of the child as they shape the environment. But more than that, as I was talking with a neurosurgeon a while ago, he explained to me that he said, I could do some surgery on your brain. He said, I could take out part of your brain. And as long as I didn't take out too much, and as long as I didn't take out the wrong part, I would hope not, right? He said, as long as I didn't take out too much or the wrong part, your brain, after I stitched you back up, would fill in for the part that I removed. And I said, that's incredible. That's fascinating. He said, but hang on. He said, while your brain is capable of that, it would never be as efficient as the correct region that you began with, because it's not the area that has developed from the beginning and is intertwined with all the other areas of your brain. But that is just an illustration to us of what can happen when we have a type of learning or a type of information being given to the brain for which a region is not matured. The brain is going to treat that in the same way from a neuroplasticity standpoint. If we take our little guy here, or girl, or whoever that is, in the class, and we're asking their brain to perform a task for which it is not ready, the brain, because of neuroplasticity, says, okay, this region is just futile. It's unmyelinated. I can't use that. So it's going to find somewhere else that has myelinated and route the thinking through that. Well, what has myelinated at this early age? Well, typically it's a lower thinking center of the brain. Remember, we begin with the limbic system and relationship areas of the brain. The brain always moves, development moves from inner to outer in form of body development, and from the brain it goes from lower into higher thinking centers. That's a basic process of brain development. And so if we have a brain, we're asking it to do something it's not capable of in this particular region, it will find another region that has myelinated. At this age, it's going to be a lower thinking center, and so it routes the thinking through that lower thinking center. Let's put it in a nutshell description. If a task is asked of the brain for which the corresponding region is not matured, it will form neural routes through lower, more developed sections, resulting in almost permanent organizational damage. Are you with me? Are you following? Good. Trying to force a child to learn a concept for which he or she is not ready can actually do damage to the unmyelinated brain. This is an actual physiological occurrence in the brain. And again, just as in the case of brain surgery, you may not notice that the person has a brain area removed. You may, but you may not. But nonetheless, the damage is done, and the brain is not as efficient as what God designed it for. And the same thing here. It may not be apparently obvious, clearly out there in the open obvious that we've got some organizational damage going on in the brain, but it's not as efficient, and it's not the type of environment and learning that God intended from the beginning. It's not the ideal. Now, these were my own words. This was my own description, my own walking us through this process. Let's just hear it a bit from some scientists. This, again, is Dr. Jane Healy from her book, Endangered Minds, which I have a couple of copies of back there. Before brain regions are myelinated, they do not operate efficiently. Well, we've seen that clearly. We understand why she's saying that. So, for this reason, trying to make children master academic skills for which they do not have the requisite maturations may result in mixed up patterns of learning. If the right brain system isn't yet available or working smoothly, forcing may create a functional organization in which less adaptive lower systems are trained to do the work. Now, she calls this functional organization. I kind of prefer functional disorganization. It's not the organization that God has designed from the beginning. It's not the ideal. It's not the environment that is perfect for the brain development. And we want to be very careful about pushing that on a child. She continues and tells us that trying to drill higher level learning into immature brains may force them to perform, so they may be performing. They may seem like they're doing okay, but they're performing with lower level systems, those lower areas of the brain that the thinking has been routed through, and thus impair the skill in question. Any learning that has to be pushed into a child may end up doing more harm than good. Plunged daily into the fire of inappropriate expectation, children's early promise shrivels and non-learning becomes a habit. They may be labeled, treated, exhorted, and eventually tutored, but the basic issue remains unchanged. The school and the child are on different schedules. We have far too many schools and children on different schedules. But there's more. Let's turn our attention from brain development to eye development. Eye teaming, you heard me mention that earlier in the context of the primary motor cortex. Eye teaming is that ability to use both eyes to focus on a subject. We all need this for good reading skills. Children need it for good reading skills. There's also foveal focus, which is two-dimensional focus. Any form of reading is two-dimensional. These functions do not fully develop until approximately age 9. Also, less than 5% of vision actually occurs in our eyes. Now you say, hang on a second, what are my eyes for? They're a lens for your brain. Most of the seeing we do actually occurs in our brain, and therefore, for full vision to occur, information from all cerebral lobes must be accessed. Oh, but hang on, that could be a problem if all cerebral lobes are not developed yet, right? Full vision would not be able to occur if we don't have at least a start of development in all cerebral lobes. And that's why we don't see full vision occurring until about age 9, because that's the point at which all cerebral lobes have gotten a bit of a start on development. Dr. Raymond Moore explained this well in his book, School Can Wait, as he told us that even though a single clear visual image may be received by the eye, so you're going, I mean, haven't the eyes developed? Are they blind? No, they're not blind. They can see what they're looking at, but when it comes to decoding the material, that's the problem. As he explains, a child may not be able to decode printed material because of deficiencies in organization and interpretation in the central nervous system due to lack of maturation. So there's nothing wrong with the child. It's not like they're handicapped somehow, but they just haven't developed the ability for full decoding of printed material up until around age 9. Now, let's look just at the physical development of the eye, though. Before age 7, the ciliary bodies, which I'll show you a diagram of in a moment, they're in the eye and they control the shape of the lens. They're short, and that allows for maximum three-dimensional peripheral and distance vision. And then after age 7, the ciliary bodies begin to lengthen, and that allows for more foveal or two-dimensional vision. Combine this with the fact that the eyeball itself is not completely shaped with collagen fibers until about age 9, we start to have a deadly prescription when we have long periods of reading for the eye because of the fluid and flexible nature of the eyeball and the ciliary bodies allowing maximum three-dimensional peripheral and distance vision. Where do you get maximum three-dimensional peripheral and distance vision? Reading a book or playing outside? Yeah, playing outside, right. You don't get so much dimensional peripheral and distance, three-dimensional peripheral and distance vision indoors. And then, again, at about age 7, we begin to see the eyes allowing for more close-up work. Now, as a result of this aspect of eye development, we begin to see the rates of nearsightedness increase with the more time that a child spends reading or indoors. And in fact, the rate of nearsightedness in the U.S. has increased 66% since the 1970s, right along with the push for early childhood education. which, by the way, I'm all for early childhood education, but it needs to be the right form of early childhood education, as I'll get to in a moment. Rates of myopia, difficulty seeing distant objects, are soaring. The trend is matched in many other countries, causing eye doctors to wonder what could be causing the decline in human vision. What is going on? Now, currently, the U.S. is about 50% myopic, and that's terrible. I mean, that's really a crying shame, 50% myopic. But compare this to East Asia, 90% myopic. Seoul, Korea, 96% myopic, almost the entire population. You're not exempt here in New Zealand. The rate runs about 40%. A little better than the U.S., certainly better than East Asia, but not entirely all that good. Now, scientists have long wondered what is causing this rapid increase in myopia. The standard answer for years, and it's still believed in most of the eye doctor community, that this is purely genetic. There's nothing that we can do about myopia or nearsightedness. Well, they did a study in Alaska. That's a state in the U.S. who was one of the last states, if not the last, I think, if I remember my history right, to become a state and require schooling for the children. So we had a very unique situation where the state all of a sudden becomes part of the United States. Okay, now we have compulsory schooling. So we had children and grandparents and parents of children that have not gone to school at the customary age of around 5 or 6. And then we had an entire generation of children and young people who did go to school at the standard age of 5 or 6. And they looked at the rates of myopia in these generations. They found that the children were about 60% myopic. Okay, that's pretty high, that's not very good, and so they look and they say, well, we would expect to find very high rates of myopia in the parents and grandparents because it's genetic, right? You know what the percentage was? Look here at the chart. See that? It was less than 1%. And they said, hang on a second, that can't be genetic. Genetics don't change that fast. What's going on? And so they look around the world and they do epidemiological studies. And they found that the rates of myopia are consistently higher in more schooled regions than in rural or unschooled regions. The US, 50%. East Asia, famous for its high pressure in academics. The kids spend almost twice the amount of time in homework that the average US student spends. 90% myopic. New Zealand, 40%. Compare this, though, to Africa, a continent that is still predominantly indigenous, or at least is spending a lot of time outside, even if they are living in the cities, 10 to 20%. And as they look around the world, they find this to be a common thread. Even within one country, they did a fascinating study in Brazil and found that within the city of Natal, Brazil, it was about 13.3% myopic. Now, that's pretty low. But when they compared it to the tribes, indigenous tribes living around the city, that were not living the city life, spending more time indoors, they found 2.7%. Same ethnic group, same general genetic pool. Again, something going on with the amount of time they're spending indoors, the amount of time studying. And in fact, modern research has shown that to be absolutely true. Children who spend less time outside were at a greater risk of developing myopia, according to the Journal of Nature. They did a study and they asked, in Taiwan, they asked teachers of one school to send their kids outside for 80 minutes each day. A school right down the road, they said, keep your kids inside. We want to see if there's a difference in the myopia rates. Well, there certainly was. At the end of 1 year, the children who had not gone outside were 18% myopic, while the ones who had gone outside were only 8% myopic. Again, same general area, same general genetics and all that. Now, part of the reason for this benefit is the time spent looking at objects that are more distant than text on a page. That is a major factor. We know that distance vision is relaxing to the eye, while bringing the vision up close while reading begins to strain the eyeball, as I'll get to in a moment. But scientists have also found that the bright light we experience outside is beneficial to our eyes. To understand this, let's understand myopia. The normal eye is very rounded in shape, with the ciliary bodies right here on the sides of the lens and the focal point right here at the back of the eyeball. The myopic eye, on the other hand, begins to be elongated in shape. It stretches the eyeball essentially. It changes the focal point to farther up the eyeball, and that makes the distance vision blurry. That is basically what, you say, what is myopia? It's this right here, an elongated eyeball that changes the focal point. What they found, again from the Journal of Nature in an article titled "The Myopia Boom," light stimulates the release of dopamine in the retina. And this neurotransmitter, in turn, blocks the elongation of the eye during development. It does what? Blocks the elongation of the eye. Isn't that what we just saw? The elongation of the eye? Something is blocking the elongation of the eye. What is it? Light, stimulating the release of retinal dopamine. Retinal dopamine is produced on a diurnal cycle, which means that it ramps up during the day. And researchers now suspect that under dim, typically indoor lighting, the cycle is disrupted with consequences for eye growth. Okay, so bright light stopping the development of myopia. How much light do we need? We have light in here, right? We're not in the dark. How much light is needed? Well, according to epidemiological studies, Dr. Ian Morgan, who's a myopia researcher in Australia, tells us that children need to spend around 3 hours per day under light levels of at least 10,000 lux to be protected against myopia. Okay, there's a couple of numbers we need to look at here. First of all, how many hours per day? 3. What's your average child getting outside these days? Generally not 3. Maybe a bit of recess, but most of the time they're indoors or doing homework, or they're in the classroom, or they're in front of the television, which is even worse for the eyes. But then there's another number we need to look at here, 10,000 lux. How much is 10,000 lux? Well, it's essentially daylight. If you go outside on a bright sunny day as it is now and stand in the shade, you're getting about 10,000 lux. So it's not full sunlight, but it is full daylight. As best I can understand, now I am not a physicist. I apologize if there are any physicists here that are cringing at my layman's description, but if we have light measured is sort of like a volume. If we take a box and we could scoop up light somehow, that would be a lux measurement. So if we take a volume of light, let's say outside our windows over here, we had 10,000 lux. But if we come into this room, that same volume of light begins to be dissipated within this volume of the room, and the lux measurement begins to drop. Does that make sense? All right, so if bright daylight is 10,000 lux, who wants to take a guess at what your average well-lit classroom or office is in a lux measurement? 600. That's an excellent guess. It's about 500. Big difference, though, between 10,000 and 500, right? Now, I was doing a seminar a while ago, and somebody told me, well, actually they're requiring in most offices now that they be built with at least 700 lux. And I said, that's great, but we need 10,000, not 700, right? It's really hard to get a full 10,000 lux indoors. There's a friend of mine who, she was about 11 years old, I think, and she was having very severe myopia. And her mother was telling me the story that they went to the eye doctor one year, yearly checkups on her eyes, and the eye doctor said, I'm really sorry, but at the rate your myopia is progressing, you will be legally blind within 1 year, most likely. Can you imagine being 11 or 12 years old and hearing that? She's like, oh no. And the mother asked and said, well, what do you think is causing this? Why does my daughter have such bad myopia, nearsightedness? And the doctor, what do you think the doctor said? It's genetic. There's nothing you can do about it, he said. You have bad vision, talking to the mother, so your daughter probably has bad vision for the same reason. Well, okay, the mother went home, but on her way home, she got to thinking, she said, hang on a second. If this genetics thing is all correct, then why does my son have perfect vision and my daughter's about to go legally blind? Something's wrong with this. And she also believed that the curse causeless shall not come, as the Bible tells us. So she did some research. She came across this study about spending 2 to 3 hours outside every day. And she goes, oh, now that's very interesting. My son practically lives outside, and my daughter hates going outside. Think there's a connection between the vision? Maybe so. She said, well, supposedly there's nothing we can do to help her vision or to even stop the development of myopia, according to the doctor, but we can at least give it a try. She said, all right, new family schedule, new family rules. Daughter, you are going outside every single day for a minimum of 2 hours, period. No questions asked. Oh, Mom, really? Do I have to? She said, well, do you want to be legally blind, or would you rather go outside for a couple hours? Okay, I'll go outside. So she went outside, and she would do indoor things outside. She did all her schoolwork outside, and she would practice her violin outside. She was kind of missing the point about getting physical activity and exercise, but at least she was getting outside in the bright 10,000 lux light. Well, 6 months later, she went back to the eye doctor. He checked her eyes out, and he said, well, this is very interesting. I did not expect this. Your eyes are the same as they were 6 months ago. They left the doctor's office, didn't say a word about what was going on. 6 months later, again, went by. Now it's been a year. She should be almost legally blind by now, right? Back at the eye doctor, he checks her eyes out and said, I really don't understand this, but your eyes are the same as they were a year ago. In fact, they might even be a little bit better. Do God's methods work? Did he know what he was talking about when he says that children need to be outdoors? And now we have the research to back it up. The bright light actually stopped this young lady's development of myopia. And what we now even know is that there are between eye exercises and spending time outdoors, it is possible to even reverse myopia a little bit, if not completely, depending on the age. By 2050, half the world will be myopic, according to one study, and 1 billion people will be at a significant risk of blindness if current trends continue, according to a recent study published in the Journal of Ophthalmology. That's frightening. I think this is something that we need to address. The eyes need to actively experience the world as a whole for vision to develop fully, as Dr. Carla Hannaford tells us. Well, there's much more that we could cover. We've seen brain development. We've seen eye development, two major factors, am I right? Major factors in what age a child should be doing academic study and when they should be going to school. There's much more that we could look at. I don't have enough time, and so I'm going to move forward to a couple of other points. One being physical activity. I don't have time to get into that. We touched this morning on how important that is. Physical activity is critical for children in learning, and so they need that time, which they often don't get in the classroom. Another area, though, is language. We understand that language development is very dependent on talking together. As Dr. Healy explains to us, good language, like the synapses that make it possible, is gained only from interactive engagement. Children need to talk as well as to hear, and that's the problem often in the classroom. They're talked to and not with. They need the interactive engagement. And we know that language is a foundational building block for, if not the entire foundation, for good reading skills, as I'll touch on more in a moment. Learned helplessness is another syndrome that we find from a child who has been pushed hard in academic learning at an early age. As Dr. Raymond Moore explains to us, a child who is required to learn things before he is ready may quickly tire of them, or he may become anxiety-ridden and so frustrated he will not try at all. I often wonder how many children decide they're dumb about certain subjects when the truth is that someone simply laid on the learning too soon in a form other than the one they needed to receive it in at the time. So we just need to be careful about working with the development of a child in terms of what they're able to learn. If it's too difficult for their brain, pretty soon the brain retreats from this learning environment and it begins to see a learned helplessness response. And learned helplessness is often linked with many learning disabilities. It can transfer into other areas of life and is not always obvious until the damage is done. So we need to be very careful about initiating the learned helplessness response. Another factor is socialization. Now, we touched on this pretty clearly this morning, I think, in terms of the discussion on age segregation, and that age integration and age mixed environment is actually better for socialization. And so I won't really go into this in terms of the age environment, because we saw that clearly this morning, and let me just restate that placing them in a schoolroom with other kids the same age may not be helping. It may actually be hindering good social skills. But more than that, another factor in terms of sending a child to school at an early age is that of the effects of the loving and individualized adult attentiveness on emotional security. We used to believe in the research that the emotional areas of the brain and the cognition or the learning areas of the brain were these two sort of separate areas that sort of just maybe had a little bit of overlap. But we now know they are absolutely intertwined. You really can't separate them. And what I mean by that is that this is very backed up by research, that when a child is deprived of emotional stability, which the primary source of emotional stability for a young child is their parent, but when they're deprived of emotional stability, the brain thinks that emotional stability is a fundamental survival need, which it is for young children. And so it begins to shut off the learning, supposedly cognition areas of the brain. It says, hey, I can't handle anything else right now. I need to focus on my emotional security. And that, a child may not express that, but that is what is often going on in the brain. And so we actually hinder academic learning when we separate them from separate mother and child. As Dr. Moore explained, a child relates to people and to the world primarily through interaction with parents or parent surrogates. Even the best daycare cannot completely neutralize the negative social, emotional, and cognitive effects of mother-child discontinuity. When a child is allowed to develop a strong bond with an adult, especially a parent, a much more emotionally stable and socially competent child will be the result. And, I could cite a lot of my own research. I did a research project on a little 5-year-old boy who was having major emotional troubles, picking fights all the time, anger issues, and I realized his parents weren't giving him the attention he needed. I spent a half hour twice a week with this little boy and watched a radical transformation in his life. And I thought, wow, just a 2-month research project that I did with this little boy, and the little bit of time that I spent with him made such a big change in him. Why, how much better would it have been if the mother or the father were to devote some extra time to them? A child really needs that to help them learn well. But there's more. How about memory skills? Don't children need to go to school to help them learn how to memorize things? Well, as it turns out, that may not even be helping. It may be hurting memory skills. Look at indigenous peoples around the world with the most phenomenal memories. The North Queensland Aborigines, for example, recite a song by memory that takes 5 nights to complete. I can't remember all the verses in the hymnal for a song in the hymnal, let alone a song that takes 5 nights to complete. That's incredible. Primitive peoples can observe a herd of several hundred animals and detect the absence of a single animal and know which one it is without counting. Many of their vocabularies are full of names for very detailed aspects of the world around them. And this is absolutely true. When I was in Africa, the mission organization that I was at had a livestock program. They had about 70 cows, and the director of the livestock program was a volunteer from the U.S., a foreign volunteer. But the people who actually took care of the cows were native Maasai herdsmen. And I presented some of this material, and the director, that was a volunteer from the U.S., came and talked to me afterward, and she said, that's absolutely true. She said, we can take our herd of 70-some cows to the watering hole in the evening, and our native herdsmen will look at that herd of cows and say, we're missing such and such a cow, or we're missing 2 cows, or whatever it is. And she said her curiosity got the best of her one day, and she asked, how do you know when you're missing a cow? Can you teach me how to know when we're missing a cow? And they looked at her like, how do you not know you're missing the cow? Isn't it obvious? But no one sat them down with a book on how to memorize cows, right? How did they learn it? Well, it's just a part of their life. And in fact, they do have incredible memories. In fact, a friend of a friend told me a story about a speaker, I believe it was his friend, that had given some messages somewhere in Africa. It was an indigenous people, just in a village. And he was there a couple years later. And he asked them, just out of curiosity, he goes, he's almost kidding around. He goes, I was here a couple years ago. Does anyone remember what I talked about? And most of the church raised their hands. Yeah, we remember what you talked about. And he's like, wow, this is interesting. He goes, what was it? And they're like, well, would you like us to give you the whole sermon you did or just the main points? They remembered the entire message. They have incredible memories, and it's not because they sit down with books and learn how to memorize things. And I think the key for that is, as Dr. Jajarli explains, the schooled person depends heavily on external signs, such as the written word or Google, I added that, to hold knowledge for him. The primitive native depends on memory. Every detail of a landscape is remembered with what seems to be a photographic memory, even the first time passing through. Though most children have an eidetic memory, it is rare among schooled adults, but not among primitive non-schooled adults. We have a culture in which something else can always hold the memory for us. We can always just look it up. We can always turn to the book. We can always pull out our phones and just ask Google. Why remember something for a longer period of time? I can relate to this personally, as I used to have an excellent sense of direction. But I've noticed now that I have my smartphone, and it can always tell me where to go with the GPS, I don't have the sense of direction that I used to. And I've just noticed that in the past few years. It's definitely going to impact children as they grow years and years with this. But there's more as our time is ticking. The effect on boys, this is particularly serious because we know the destiny that God has designed for our boys to grow into men who are spiritual leaders in their families and their churches. Because of that 2-year lag in brain development, and I hate calling it a lag. It's not that boys are slow or behind somehow. They just develop differently. We tend to assess it from a perspective of how a girl develops, and so we say that, well, boys must be behind, but it's definitely not that way. But because of the 2-year lag in terms of academic learning, as we see it in standard, all the effects we've just discussed are intensified in boys. And in fact, boys today are not learning as well as girls. They receive 70% of the D's and F's given all students. They cause 90% of classroom discipline problems. 80% of all high school dropouts are boys. Millions of American boys are on Ritalin and under mind-bending control drugs. And 3 out of 4 students labeled learning disabled are boys. Are boys just somehow a problem? Did God just create them to be troublemakers? No. What did he create them for? I've already said he created them to be spiritual leaders. And yet what are we doing to them as we place them in an environment and conditioning them? And I say this with all, I'm not meaning to be critical or overgeneralize, but I think you'll understand what I mean when I say that we're conditioning them in an environment where they're always somehow dumber or inferior to the girls in terms of the academic learning. Not through any fault of their own, but simply that their brains don't develop the same, and they're going to always look like they're behind in the early years of life. But what about reading skills? Can children learn reading if we don't put them in school and start them at age 5? Well, the Early Childhood Research Quarterly did a significant research project, and I'm always excited to see things from the Early Childhood Research Quarterly. It is an excellent peer-reviewed journal that compiles research from all over the world, and they found that it is an absolute myth that children need to learn reading early or they'll never learn it. And what they did find is that the foundation of later reading, and in particular reading comprehension, is language. Okay. Lay the foundation for good reading skills in language. How do we do that? I hear it. Talk to them, right. Conversation, that's how we build language. You don't have to sit down with a book and memorize vocab lists. That is not the best way to build language. Talking together is a natural way to build language in a child. Simply talking together can help children learn how to read. Another thing we can do that is often neglected in modern education is to use books and reading as a source of gaining needed information about something rather than a boring drill that they have to go through. We have a reading series in the U.S. called the Dick and Jane reading series, and I think whoever invented it was just trying to make kids bored. I mean, Dick and Jane ran, Dick and Spot ran, and Dick and Jane jumped, and who cares about Dick and Jane? When your children have a question, when they want to learn something, well, look it up in the book, and you just taught them that it's a source of gaining needed information about something. And of course, it's better to do than to read. But what's even more interesting, if we look at the Early Childhood Research Quarterly and the project that they did, they compared 2 groups of children. They had a group of children who started their reading instruction at age 5, and another group who started their reading instruction at age 7. And what they found is that the earlier reading instruction age group, the ones who started at age 5, had initially superior letter naming, non-word, word, and passage reading, but this difference in reading skill disappeared by age 11. And the later RIA had generally greater reading comprehension. In fact, if we look here at a chart, this is measuring the average decoding and reading fluency. The blue is age 5. Those who started at age 5, here they go, off to a start at reading. Age 6, they continue with reading. Evidently, we have a small group here of the later starters who must have taught themselves how to read. And then age 7, we have the next group coming in. But look how far ahead these age 5 readers. They're never going to catch up, right? These ones who started later are always going to be handicapped. Oh, but wait. Look, 2 years later, they've caught up. Look, 2 years later, even more. They passed them up in average decoding and reading fluency. So really, I mean, if I could put it bluntly, The first 2 years for this earlier group were wasted. It didn't do them any good in the long run. In fact, if we look at the long run, those who started earlier, their abilities began to plateau, while those who started later, their abilities continued to rise. They looked at Montessori schools. Well, the Montessori children did have an advantage in reading over the public school children at age 5, but not at age 12. Again, the difference disappeared. So what they concluded was telling us that our findings suggest that success at reading is not assured by an earlier beginning. So why do we want to stress the eyes, as we've seen, cause possible brain disorganization, as we've seen, and maybe not even teach them how to read well and cause possible damage to future reading abilities? And I could cite many other studies that cite much better fluency and comprehension in those who start later. They're typically better readers. And in fact, the research shows that if the brain is ready, it only takes about 30 contact hours to learn reading to a college proficient levels. 30 hours. A minimal amount of time if the brain is ready for it. The key is to answer the questions that come up for your child. It's not like you want to hide all books and put them in a locker. No. As they look at things, as they ask questions, hey, Mom, what's this say? Can you read this to me? Can you teach me how to write my name? Things like that come up. Answer those questions, and you'll build the foundation blocks, and more often than not, a child will actually teach themselves how to read, as has been documented in hundreds, if not thousands, of cases. But in the last 7 minutes that we have, what about being left behind? Won't a child be delayed if we don't start them by age 5? Won't they be behind their peers? And that's a fantastic question. But as it turns out, children who start academics after age 8 usually end up far ahead of the early starters. Why? Because when children are given time for their minds to develop, they will experience much less frustration when the academics do begin, and will learn much faster when they are ready to learn it. One study found, in a study of 300 individuals who started school at about age 8 or later, all of them quickly caught up with their classes and in most cases performed well above the class average. Now, you're saying, okay, how is this going to work? If I wait until my child is 8 to 10 and I put them in school in first grade, how are they ever going to catch up? Well, if we keep them year by year in each grade, then definitely they will be behind. The point here is that they actually catch up. And let me just illustrate this with an imperfect example. I apologize to all the teachers here who are going, that's not perfectly accurate. Hypothetical scenario to help us illustrate the point, all right? Let's imagine that we have in first grade, we have this little 5-year-old and we're teaching him the addition of ones, and that's 7 plus 5. 5 plus 3, 2 plus 2, that's addition of ones. Well, because the brain maybe isn't quite ready to grasp this fully, you have to do a lot of repetition, and that's the first key. In most curriculum and early schooling as we see it today, repetition, 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 over and over and over and over. Why? Because often the brain is not ready for the particular type of learning, and so we have to drill it into them through repetition instead of through deep understanding of the concept. Okay, so first grade we have addition of ones. Second grade rolls around, addition of tens. Again, hypothetical scenario, but you'll understand my point in a moment. Addition of 10, so 13 plus 14, those sort of addition problems. Again, more repetition. And besides, when you got to second grade, you had to back up and repeat a bunch of stuff that you did in first grade to help them catch up to speed. Third grade rolls around, and now you have addition of hundreds, 133 plus 244, those sort of math problems. Fourth grade, you finally get there, and you are adding thousands, 4,330 plus 5,680, those sort of math problems. And again, you've had to repeat often and often and often throughout those 4 years to finally get them to the point that they could add thousands. Let's suppose, though, we wait until fourth grade. Now, I'm not suggesting that we just totally eliminate learning and we don't teach children anything at an early age. No, you can teach a lot. Think of all the math you can learn in the kitchen, for example. But suppose that in everyday life they were learning basic math concepts, and yet we didn't put it on paper until fourth grade rolled around. We sit down, addition of ones, 5 plus 3. Can you understand that? Well, sure they can understand that at fourth grade. Okay, move to addition of tens, move to addition of hundreds, move to addition of thousands. It's an easy concept for them at that age because they've seen in real life early on the concept of math and addition. They've seen how it works. And so now they're just transferring it to paper. And so in an hour, you've taught the addition of thousands. And you've taught what could have taken 4 years to get there. Do you understand what I mean by catching up? Again, this is a hypothetical scenario, but that's what I mean by catching up. It's not that we're keeping them locked in grade by grade, but we are helping teach them things in practical life. That is a good learning environment for children. Then we transfer it to books at a later age when their eyes and their brain is ready to comprehend it, and the learning will blossom and they'll quickly catch up. Most children, 2 or 3 months, they're up with their grade level. Lastly, spirituality. This is a point which we mustn't leave undiscussed. Spirituality, the right hemisphere doesn't entirely control, but it's very important in spiritual strength and understanding. Again, I mentioned that earlier in terms of the development of the right hemisphere for boys, that they take a bit longer. Right hemisphere helps with spirituality. We also know that the early years are a critical window of development for the right hemisphere. In other words, if they miss out on this window of development, the right hemisphere, we run the risk of it being forever stunted in its development if we miss out on that window of time in the early years. We also know that pressure to develop the left hemisphere through academic study often suppresses the development of the right hemisphere. What are the implications of this? Have we seen the decrease in spirituality in our youth today? And I know this is not the only factor. I'm not blind to that. There are many other reasons. But this is definitely a major problem. And again, focusing on the boys and men, does Satan know what he's doing here? He's pushing it earlier and earlier. He's pushing it for the boys earlier and earlier. Those boys that should have a future of leading their families and churches in spirituality. He's working hard on damaging the spiritual development. And again, it's just a misplacement of priorities. Children should be learning. What should they be learning? We know that the areas of the brain that control morality, conscience, character, cause to effect reasoning, many other important things, the foundations for those are laid in the first years of a child's life. Satan knows that too. He knows that parents really should be focusing on character development early on, but he gets them to focus on something else and believe that something else is most important. And that's why I titled this talk, Doing the Right Job at the Wrong Time. Academic learning is great, but they'll learn much better if we wait. And they're missing out, though, on important character development if we're skipping the early years of character development. So, does that research line up with what we read earlier? Parents should be the only teacher of their children until they have reached 8 or 10 years of age. As fast as their minds can comprehend it, parents should open before them God's great book of nature. 8 or 10. Does that work with all the science we saw? The brain development, the eye development, and all that? It absolutely does. The Lord knew what he was talking about. Great book of nature. That's a book that doesn't use close-up vision. That's good for the eyes. And the schoolroom, until 8 or 10 years of age, should be in the open air. Amid the opening flowers and nature's beautiful scenery, their most familiar textbook, The Treasures of Nature. These lessons imprinted upon the minds of young children amid the pleasant, attractive scenes of nature will not soon be forgotten. Let's do the right job at the right time, not the wrong job at the wrong time. Not the right job at the wrong time. Let's do the right job at the right time. Let's focus on the learning that is important for children at an early age and allow this to take place later on. Let's close with prayer. Father in heaven, thank you again for the modern research that we have now that shows what is important for children. Thank you for the time that we've had to look at that. And Lord, I just pray again for the families here that they'll be able to implement this in their lives, in their children's lives, and do it as best and follow your plan for their children. We ask your blessing on our night now, and grant us a good night of rest, and we thank you for the day that will be coming tomorrow. And we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
And we can't go wrong if we